Greg was yelling in the hallway when he saw the envelope. He had that same loud voice he'd been using for the past 2 years. The one the entire floor could hear whether they wanted to or not. "What is this?" he said, waving the paper. I was standing a few feet away, holding a small stack of documents from the management office. He looked down at the notice again, then back at me. At first he was confused. Then he saw the name at the bottom. My name. That's when the yelling stopped. For 2 years, Greg had made my life miserable in that building. Noise at all hours, false complaints, treating the place like the rules didn't apply to him. Management never did anything about it. The owner never responded. So I did something much simpler. I documented everything. And when the building quietly went up for sale one morning, I bought it. When I first moved into that building, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. It was a fairly normal apartment complex. Not brand new, but well kept enough that it felt comfortable. The kind of place where people came and went quietly, everyone mostly minding their own business. I had just moved to the area for work and needed something simple. Nothing fancy, just a place that was clean, reasonably priced, and close enough to the office that my commute wouldn't turn into a daily headache. The unit I found checked all those boxes. Second floor, small balcony, decent view of the parking lot and a line of trees behind it. The first few weeks were exactly what I expected. Quiet evenings, people passing each other politely in the hallway. The usual small interactions you have in apartment buildings. A nod in the elevator. Someone holding the door. Nothing memorable. Then I met Greg. Greg lived 2 doors down from me. At first he seemed normal enough. Friendly in that loud, overly confident way some people have. The kind of person who introduces himself immediately and talks like you've known each other for years. "Greg," he said the first time we crossed paths in the hallway. He shook my hand firmly and smiled. Good to have someone new on the floor. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But the first real sign of trouble came a few nights later. Around midnight, I started hearing music through the wall. Not faint music, loud music. The kind where you can feel the bass through the drywall. At first I assumed it was temporary. Maybe he was having friends over. Maybe it was just one late night. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Sometimes it wasn't music. Sometimes it was voices. Groups of people talking loudly in the hallway or on the balcony outside his unit. Doors slamming. Laughter echoing down the corridor. Again, I try to give him the benefit of the doubt. Apartment living comes with some level of noise. Nobody expects perfect silence. But after a few weeks, it became obvious that Greg didn't operate by the same set of assumptions as everyone else in the building. He treated the place like it was his personal space. Late-night gatherings during the week. Guests coming and going at odd hours. Leaving trash bags in the hallway instead of taking them to the dumpster. Once I even found a half-empty pizza box sitting on the shared stairwell landing for 2 days. Small things individually, but constant. Eventually, I did what most people do in that situation. I spoke to management. The leasing office was on the first floor. A small office with 2 desks and a manager who always seemed slightly overwhelmed. I explained the situation calmly. "Just some late-night noise," I said. "Nothing major. I just want to make sure it's on record." The manager nodded and wrote something down. "We'll take care of it," she said. I left feeling like the issue would probably sort itself out. For about a week, things were quieter. Then the complaints started coming, but not about Greg. About me. The first one was almost funny. Management emailed me saying another tenant had reported that I was creating disturbances in the hallway, which didn't make sense. I worked long hours and was barely home most evenings. I went downstairs and asked the manager about it. She checked the report. The complaint had come from Greg. I remember standing there for a moment, slightly confused, because until that moment, I hadn't realized what kind of neighbor Greg actually was. The kind who flips the story before anyone else can tell it. The next few months made that very clear. If music was loud at night and someone complained, Greg would file a complaint about me the next day. If guests were making noise in the hallway, suddenly management would receive a message saying I had been hostile or disruptive. None of it was true. But management didn't investigate much either. They simply logged the complaints and moved on, which meant Greg had discovered something important about the system. If you complain loudly enough, the truth becomes harder to sort out. That's when I made a decision. I stopped arguing. I stopped trying to convince management who was right. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every incident, every late-night disturbance, every complaint filed against me. Dates, times, emails, photos when necessary. I kept it all organized, because if there was one thing I understood clearly by that point, it was that Greg thought the system was something he could play. What he didn't realize yet was that I was about to play it better. Once I realized what Greg was doing, I stopped treating the situation emotionally. That was probably the most important decision I made during those 2 years. Because the instinct when someone keeps pushing you is to push back, to argue, to confront them in the hallway, to make sure they understand you're not the kind of person they can run over. But the problem with that approach is simple. People like Greg are very comfortable inside chaos. Arguments give them exactly what they want. So I didn't argue. I documented. Every time the music started after quiet hours, I wrote down the time. If guests were yelling in the hallway at 1 in the morning, I logged it. If trash appeared in shared spaces, I took a photo and emailed management. Not emotionally, just factually. Noise disturbance from Unit 204 at 12:47 a.m. Trash left in stairwell outside Unit 204. Multiple guests entering Unit 204 after quiet hours. Short emails. Timestamps. Attachments when necessary. At first, management responded the same way they always had. A quick acknowledgement. We'll look into it. Then nothing. Weeks passed. Then months. Greg continued behaving exactly the same way. Loud music. Late-night guests. Occasional shouting matches with people who had been drinking in his apartment. The strange thing was that Greg never acted worried. If anything, he seemed more confident over time, and I eventually understood why. Management didn't enforce anything. They logged complaints. They sent occasional warning emails. But nothing actually changed. From Greg's perspective, the system had no consequences. And because he had already started filing complaints against me early on, he probably assumed the record made both of us look equally problematic. But that wasn't actually true, because while Greg was creating noise and filing accusations, I was building a file. Every email, every complaint, every response from management, all organized, time-stamped, backed up, not because I planned some dramatic confrontation, but because documentation turns chaos into structure. About a year into living there, the pattern became predictable. Greg would host people late at night. Someone on the floor would complain. Greg would respond the next day by filing a complaint about someone else. Sometimes about me. Sometimes about other neighbors. Management would log everything and move on. The building itself slowly started gaining a reputation. Tenants talked in the elevator about noise. People complained about management being impossible to reach. Maintenance requests taking weeks to get answered. From a distance, the place still looked fine. But internally, the reputation was deteriorating. That's when something interesting happened. One afternoon, I was having coffee with a friend of mine who works in real estate. He asked where I was living. I mentioned the building. He laughed slightly. "Yeah, I've heard about that place," he said. Not in a good way. Apparently, the building had developed a reputation among brokers. Poor management, tenant complaints, maintenance issues, the kind of problems that quietly drag down property value over time. Then he said something that caught my attention. I heard the owner might be looking to sell it privately. I looked at him. Privately? Yeah, he said. Off-market. Quiet sale. Probably trying to unload it before the reputation gets worse. The comment stayed in my mind after that conversation ended, because up until that moment, the building had just been the place where I lived. But once you start thinking about property, you start seeing it differently. Not just hallways and neighbors. Numbers. Leases. Value. Opportunity. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. Reading public records. Looking at comparable buildings in the area. researching what properties like that typically sold for. The more I looked, the clearer the situation became. The building wasn't poorly located. The structure itself was solid. The problem wasn't the asset. The problem was management. And poor management creates one very specific opportunity: undervaluation. From the outside, the building looked like a headache. From the inside, it looked like something else entirely. A property that was simply being run badly. And badly run properties tend to sell for less than they should. A few months later, my real estate friend called me again. "Remember that building you live in?" he asked. "Yeah, it's happening," he said. "The owner is quietly accepting offers." I sat there for a moment thinking about the hallway outside my apartment. Greg's music late at night. The complaints. The documentation file sitting on my computer. Then I asked a simple question. What kind of number are they looking for? My friend told me. And the moment I heard it, I realized something. Greg thought the system protected him. What he didn't know yet was that I was about to become the system. When my friend told me the building was quietly accepting offers, I didn't react immediately. I just sat there for a moment thinking about the number he had mentioned. It was lower than I expected. Not dramatically low, but low enough that it told a story. Buildings usually lose value for only a few reasons: location problems, structural problems, or management problems. This one wasn't in a bad area, and the building itself was solid, which meant the discount was coming from the third problem: reputation. The place had developed a reputation for being poorly managed. Tenants complained. Maintenance took too long. Noise issues never got resolved. From the outside, buyers see that kind of situation and assume the property will be a headache. And headaches tend to lower the price. That realization stayed in my mind for the rest of the day. At first, I tried to ignore it. I had never owned an apartment building before. Buying something like that isn't the kind of decision you make casually. But once the thought appeared, it didn't leave. Because I had been living inside that building for more than a year. I knew its problems better than anyone. And more importantly, I knew which problems were real and which ones were just the result of management not doing their job. Over the next few weeks, I started researching quietly, not telling anyone what I was thinking, just gathering information. I looked at property records, checked the building's size, age, and history, compared it to other apartment buildings in the area, what they had sold for, what they were renting units for, what their vacancy rates looked like. The more numbers I looked at, the clearer the picture became. The building itself wasn't failing. It was simply neglected. Maintenance was slow. Tenant behavior wasn't enforced. Management treated complaints like paperwork instead of responsibility. But none of those things were permanent problems. They were operational problems. Problems that could be fixed. And buildings with fixable problems sometimes create opportunity. I also looked carefully at the rental income. Every unit, every lease, what people were paying, what comparable buildings were charging nearby. The gap was noticeable. The property wasn't reaching its potential. At that point, I stopped thinking about it as the building I live in. I started thinking about it as an asset, a collection of leases, a stream of income, a structure that could be improved with better oversight. Of course, thinking about something and actually doing it are two different things. Buying property requires financing. So the next step was figuring out whether that part was even possible. I spoke to a lender. Carefully, hypothetically, what would it look like if someone wanted to purchase a small apartment building like this? We talked through numbers, loan structures, down payments, cash flow expectations. It wasn't simple, but it wasn't impossible either. And that's when the idea stopped being theoretical. It started becoming a plan. Over the next month, I ran the numbers repeatedly. Different scenarios, different financing structures. What would happen if some tenants left? What would happen if repairs cost more than expected? Every angle, every risk. Eventually, the math started making sense. Not perfect, but solid enough. So when the building officially opened for private offers, I was ready. I submitted one. Quietly. No drama. Just paperwork. Then came the waiting. Real estate transactions move slower than people expect. Weeks passed. During that time, nothing about the building itself changed. Greg was still Greg. Music late at night. Guests in the hallway. occasional arguments that echoed through the walls. And every time something happened, I added another note to my file. Date, time, description, because documentation had become a habit by that point. A few weeks later, my phone rang. It was my real estate friend. "Looks like your offer is being accepted," he said. I sat there quietly for a moment, not celebrating, just processing, because the moment that deal closed, my role in that building would change completely. I wouldn't just be a tenant anymore. I would be the owner, which meant the same complaints management had ignored for 2 years would suddenly become my responsibility. The closing process took another month. Inspections, paperwork, financing approvals, all the usual steps that happen behind the scenes in property transactions. Then one morning, I sat down at a conference table and signed the final documents. Just like that, the building belonged to me. The first week, as the new owner, was busy, meeting with maintenance contractors, reviewing operating expenses, getting a clear picture of everything management had been neglecting. But the most important review was something simpler. The leases, every tenant, every agreement, every record on file. And when I reached Greg's file, I noticed something very interesting. He already had 3 documented lease violations. What Greg didn't know yet was that those violations were about to matter. When I finished reviewing Greg's file, I didn't rush into anything. That was the difference between reacting and managing. For 2 years, Greg had created problems in that building because nobody had taken the time to enforce the rules properly. Management logged complaints, sent warning emails, and then moved on. But a lease isn't just paperwork. It's a contract, and contracts only matter if someone is willing to enforce them. Greg's file was thicker than most. 3 formal violations, each one documented. Noise disturbances after quiet hours, improper use of shared spaces, multiple complaints from neighboring tenants, all recorded by the previous management. What they hadn't done was act on them. But violations don't disappear just because someone ignores them. They stay on record. That's why I took my time during that first week. I reviewed every tenant file in the building. Some tenants had perfect records, quiet, reliable, rent paid on time. Others had small issues that could easily be corrected with a conversation. But Greg's pattern stood out, not because the violations were dramatic, because they were consistent. Consistent behavior tells you something about how a tenant views the rules. And Greg clearly believed the rules didn't apply to him. Still, I didn't go looking for a confrontation. That's not how property management works when it's done correctly. The system already has a process. You simply follow it. So the first step was simple. Formal notice. Not emotional. Not personal. Just documentation. A letter referencing the existing violations in his file and reminding him of the lease terms regarding noise, shared spaces, and tenant conduct. The notice went out along with several others that week, because Greg wasn't the only tenant who had been operating without oversight, but he was the one who noticed it first. 2 days later, I heard him in the hallway arguing with someone from the maintenance team. His voice was loud enough that half the floor could probably hear it. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I've lived here for years. Nobody has ever bothered me about this before." The maintenance worker calmly told him the building had new ownership. That seemed to confuse him. Greg hadn't connected the dots yet. To him, it was just another piece of paperwork from management. Another warning that probably wouldn't lead anywhere, which was exactly the mindset that had created the situation in the first place. Over the next week, things stayed quiet. Then, one Friday night, the music started again. Loud, bass vibrating through the walls, just like before. Guests laughing in the hallway. Doors slamming. Exactly the same pattern I had been documenting for the past 2 years. Only now, the circumstances were different. This time the complaint didn't go to an indifferent management office. It came directly to me, because several tenants emailed the new management address to report the noise. I logged the incident, checked the time, confirmed the complaints, then followed the next step in the lease enforcement process. Second violation notice. Again, nothing emotional. Just documentation referencing the new incident and the existing record. The letter was delivered the next morning. Greg received it sometime that afternoon. That evening, I heard him outside my door in the hallway talking to another neighbor. "They're overreacting," he said loudly. "It's just music." From his perspective, It probably did feel like an overreaction, because for years nobody had held him accountable. But systems change when someone decides to run them properly. A few days later, the third incident happened. Not music this time. Trash bags left in the hallway outside his unit. Something several tenants had complained about repeatedly in the past. Again documented. Again recorded. And with that incident, the lease violations reached the threshold required for formal eviction proceedings. At that point, the process was no longer about opinion. It was about policy. So I prepared the paperwork. Notice of lease termination. Legal language. Official documentation. Everything exactly as required. The notice was printed and placed in an envelope with the building letterhead. I walked down the hallway and slipped it under Greg's door. The same hallway where I had spent 2 years listening to his late-night parties and false complaints. A few minutes later, I heard his door open. Paper rustling. Then silence. Curiosity must have gotten the better of him, because about 30 seconds later his door closed again and his footsteps moved quickly down the hall. When he reached the end of the corridor, he stopped. I happened to be standing there reviewing some maintenance paperwork. Greg looked down at the eviction notice again, then slowly lifted his eyes toward me. And that's when he noticed the name listed under property owner. Greg stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he looked back at me, then down at the paper again. You could almost see the moment where the pieces started connecting in his head. "Wait," he said slowly. "You." His voice had lost the confidence it usually carried. Not angry yet, just confused. I didn't say much. There wasn't really anything to explain. The paperwork spoke for itself. Greg looked down again and read the notice more carefully this time. The language was formal, legal, referencing the lease agreement, the documented violations, and the termination notice. Everything by the book. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "I've lived here longer than you." "That's possible," I said calmly. "But the lease terms still apply." He shook his head. No, management handles this stuff." "I'm management now," I said. The hallway went quiet. For 2 years, Greg had been operating under one assumption, that nobody in authority actually cared enough to enforce the rules. That assumption had worked very well for him, until that moment. He looked down at the notice again. "You're serious about this?" he asked. I nodded slightly. "The violations are documented," I said. "The lease terms are clear." For a moment, it looked like he might argue. Greg was the kind of person who normally enjoyed confrontation. But the situation had shifted. When you argue with another tenant, it's a personal conflict. When you argue with the owner of the building, it's a contractual one. Contracts are harder to shout at. "You can't just kick me out like this," he said. "I'm not kicking you out," I replied. The lease violations triggered the process. The distinction mattered. Everything that had happened was already written down. 2 years of complaints. 3 documented violations. Formal notices sent in the correct order. The eviction wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Greg looked around the hallway like he was hoping someone else would appear and change the conversation. But the hallway stayed quiet. "You planned this," he said finally. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I documented it." That answer seemed to frustrate him more than anything else. Because planning suggests manipulation. Documentation suggests patience. Greg spent the next few days trying different approaches. First, he tried arguing. Emails complaining about unfair treatment. Messages insisting the noise complaints were exaggerated. I responded the same way every time. Brief. Professional. Referencing the lease and the documented violations. Then he tried a different approach. One evening, he knocked on my door. When I opened it, he stood there holding the eviction notice again. "Look," he said, "we can work something out." I waited. "Maybe the paperwork got out of hand," he continued. You know how these things go. The irony of that sentence wasn't lost on me. For 2 years, paperwork had been ignored in that building. Now it suddenly mattered to him. "The process is already underway," I said. He sighed. "You're really going to push this?" "I'm enforcing the lease." Greg studied my face for a moment like he was searching for something. Anger. Satisfaction. Anything that suggested this was personal. But there wasn't anything to find. Because it wasn't personal. It was administrative. After that conversation, he stopped trying to negotiate. Instead, he began packing. The next week was surprisingly quiet. No music. No late-night gatherings. No trash left in the hallway. For the first time since I had moved into the building, the floor felt peaceful. Greg's eviction date approached quickly. Legal timelines move at their own pace once the process begins. Tenants receive notice. Deadlines are established, and eventually the lease ends. The morning Greg moved out was uneventful. A moving truck arrived around 9. A couple of people carried boxes down the stairs. By early afternoon, the truck was gone. Greg left without saying another word to me. The hallway was quiet again. For the first time in 2 years, completely quiet. And as I stood there looking down the corridor, I realized something interesting. Greg had spent 2 years believing the system didn't work. What he never understood was that the system works perfectly if someone takes the time to document everything. Greg didn't say goodbye when he left. There wasn't a final argument. No last dramatic moment in the hallway. Just a moving truck one morning, a few boxes carried down the stairs, and by early afternoon the apartment was empty. After 2 years of constant noise, complaints, and tension, the quiet felt almost unusual. I remember walking down the hallway that evening just to check a few things. The lights, the stairwell, the door to Greg's old unit. Everything looked normal. For the first time since I had moved into that building, the floor actually felt calm. The interesting thing about situations like that is how quickly the environment changes once the right structure is in place. The eviction wasn't the result of one bad night or one complaint. It was the result of documentation. 2 years of incidents, emails, photos, dates, times. Each piece of information small on its own, but powerful when organized together. That's what Greg never understood. He thought the system was something he could play. If someone complained about him, he filed a complaint back. If management sent a warning, he ignored it. Because the people running the building before me didn't enforce anything. So from his perspective, the rules didn't matter. But systems only fail when nobody takes the time to run them properly. Once someone does, the system starts working exactly as it was designed to. The week after Greg moved out, I began addressing the rest of the building's issues. Maintenance requests that had been sitting unanswered for months. Broken hallway lights. Repairs that previous management had postponed repeatedly. Most of the problems weren't complicated. They had simply been ignored. Within a few weeks, the building already felt different. Tenants started noticing. People who had barely spoken to management before suddenly stopped by the office to say thank you for fixing things. One neighbor mentioned something that stuck with me. I didn't realize how much the noise on this floor was affecting everyone, she said. That one apartment made the whole place feel chaotic. That's the thing about environments like that. One person can create a ripple effect that spreads through the entire building. But the opposite is also true. Remove the problem, and the entire space changes. Greg's old unit was cleaned, repaired, and listed for rent again. This time the screening process was much more thorough than the one I had experienced when I first moved in. Income verification, rental history, background checks. Not because I expected every tenant to cause problems, but because prevention is easier than eviction. Within a month, the unit was rented again. The new tenant was quiet, respectful, and paid rent on time. Exactly the kind of tenant every building hopes to have. Life in the building gradually settled into something predictable. Repairs were handled quickly. Complaints were addressed properly. Rules were enforced consistently. And when rules are enforced consistently, people stop testing them. I still live in the same apartment during that first year of ownership. Sometimes I would walk past the unit Greg used to occupy and think about how strange the entire situation had been. For 2 years, he had believed he controlled the narrative. Filing complaints, creating noise, acting like the rules didn't apply to him. But the truth was much simpler. He had been leaving a trail of documentation behind the entire time. All I had done was organize it. Occasionally, someone would ask me if buying the building had been motivated by Greg specifically. The answer was always the same. No, the building was a good investment opportunity. The poor management had created a gap between what the property was worth and what it was selling for. Greg just happened to be one of the problems that poor management allowed to grow. Once the management changed, the outcome became predictable. And that's really the lesson I took from the entire experience. Patience matters. Documentation matters, and systems tend to work when someone is willing to use them properly. Greg thought he was dealing with another tenant. What he never realized was that I had been preparing for something much bigger. Looking back, I don't feel angry about those 2 years. Frustrated at times, sure, but mostly I see it as an education. Because the same habit that helped me deal with Greg, documenting everything carefully, ended up helping me run the entire building better. And in the end, the resolution wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no revenge, just paperwork, signed exactly where it needed to be. If you enjoy stories about patience paying off in ways people never expect, make sure you're subscribed. And if you've ever dealt with someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them, you probably understand why sometimes the most powerful move is simply letting the system do its job. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.